There is a version of you that has been carefully constructed over many years. You probably don't think of it as constructed. You think of it as discovered that somewhere in your 20s, or after a particular loss, or through enough therapy, you finally figured out who you actually are. You have a type, a set of values you can name on command, a personality framework that explains your reactions before you have to examine them. You know how you handle conflict, how you process grief, how you make decisions. You've become, in the most precise sense of the word, legible, to yourself and to others. And that legibility feels like an achievement. This is the thing no one will tell you. It isn't. What you have built is not self-knowledge. It is a management system. A story sophisticated enough to feel like truth, flexible enough to absorb new information without requiring you to change, and, most crucially, sealed tightly enough to keep certain things permanently out of view. The self you think you know is largely the self that survived the editing process. What didn't make the cut is still there. It simply learned to wait. Carl Jung spent the better part of 40 years trying to explain what happens to everything a human being refuses to be. He called it the shadow, not in the pop psychology sense of your dark side, which domesticates the concept into something manageable, but in the precise sense of the psychic content that gets excluded from the conscious personality in the process of becoming someone. You didn't choose your shadow. You chose your persona, the face you wear, the identity you inhabit, and the shadow was whatever was left over, the rejected material, the parts that were inconvenient, threatening, too much, not enough, incompatible with the story you needed to be able to tell. The shadow doesn't disappear when excluded, it accumulates. And here is where most accounts of this idea stop, because the next part is less comfortable. The shadow isn't just your cruelty or your rage or the appetites you won't admit to. It is also, and perhaps more dangerously, your unlived intelligence, your unacknowledged capability, the thing you could have become if you had chosen differently and didn't. The shadow contains everything you buried, including some of what was best in you, because it was too frightening, too large, too incompatible with the person other people needed you to be. What you call self-knowledge is, at least in part, a story constructed to avoid this encounter. Here is a question worth sitting with. When did you last have a feeling that didn't fit? Not a feeling you were ashamed of. Shame is actually quite easy to integrate. It confirms the self-narrative by showing you where you fall short of your own standards. Something stranger than that. A flash of contempt for someone you're supposed to love, an unexpected relief at someone else's failure, a sudden, sourceless grief in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, a burst of fury so disproportionate to its trigger that you had to immediately explain it away. What do you do with those moments? If you are like most people who think seriously about themselves, you do one of several things. You contextualize it. I was tired, I was stressed, it doesn't mean anything. You pathologize it. This is old trauma. This is my attachment style. This is the thing I'm working on in therapy. Or, most commonly, you absorb it into the narrative. Of course I felt that because I'm the kind of person who... The feeling gets filed. The system updates. The story holds. What you almost never do is let it remain unexplained. Jung's actual claim, the one that gets quietly glossed over in the simplified versions, was not that you should excavate your shadow and integrate it as a self-improvement project. The claim was more radical and more disturbing than that. You cannot encounter the shadow through the very faculties the ego uses to manage it. The intellect that built the story cannot be the instrument that sees through it. Introspection, in this context, is not a solution. It is, in many cases, an especially sophisticated form of avoidance because it gives you the feeling of looking inward without requiring you to actually arrive somewhere destabilizing. You have probably spent considerable time thinking about yourself. Consider the possibility that this has made the problem worse. There is a specific texture to the kind of person this describes, and it is worth naming precisely because the general version is too easy to dismiss. You are not someone who avoids self-reflection. Quite the opposite. You have probably done more of it than most people you know. You have read the books, done the work, developed a vocabulary for your interior life that most people lack entirely. You can describe your childhood with clinical accuracy. You understand your patterns. You can name the wound and trace it forward into your current behaviors with something close to elegance. And yet, the relationships that keep going wrong do so in ways that remain, at some level, mysterious to you. Even after all the analysis, the same impasse appears in different forms, with different people, in different contexts. The growth feels real, and then suddenly, you are standing in a situation that is structurally identical to one you were certain you had left behind. You have insight without traction. You understand everything and seem unable to move. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of method. Erich Fromm, writing in the middle of the 20th century, made an observation that cuts directly to this. Human beings are not primarily motivated by the desire for pleasure or even the avoidance of pain. They are primarily motivated by the avoidance of freedom, by which he meant not freedom in the political sense, but the freedom that comes from being genuinely undetermined, genuinely open, genuinely without the defensive structure that makes life feel navigable. Freedom in this sense is terrifying because it requires giving up the story. And the story is not just how we understand ourselves. For most people, it is the primary mechanism by which existence feels tolerable. You do not maintain your self-narrative because you are weak or unexamined. You maintain it because the alternative is to stand in front of something that has no name yet. And that is among the most threatening experiences available to a conscious being. The question is whether the narrative, however necessary it once was, has become a prison you've mistaken for home. Let's get specific, because the abstract version of this idea is easy to nod at and then forget. Think about the last time someone described you inaccurately. A colleague, a friend, a family member who said something about you that was clearly wrong. Not hurtful necessarily, just wrong. You knew exactly what they were missing. You could articulate with precision why their read of you was incomplete. The correction formed in you immediately, even if you didn't voice it. Now consider, what if the intensity of that correction, the quickness of it, the certainty, was itself a signal? Jung's concept of projection works like this. The content of the shadow, because it cannot be tolerated as one's own, gets perceived as belonging to someone else. You don't see your own rigidity, you see other people's refusal to listen. You don't see your own hunger for admiration, you see other people's vanity. You don't see your own unacknowledged despair, you see other people's weakness. The projection protects the story by relocating the threatening material outside the boundaries of the self, where it can be observed, criticized, even condemned, without ever having to be claimed. This is not a marginal phenomenon. This is, for most people, the primary way the psyche processes its own unacceptable content. And the clue is always the heat. When a response is disproportionate, when the irritation exceeds what the situation warrants, when the contempt has a particular edge, when the admiration tilts into something uncomfortably close to envy, that excess is almost never about the other person. It is the shadow knocking. It is the excluded content seeking the only form of recognition available to it, being seen in someone else where it is safe to look. What this means in practice is that your irritations are a more accurate map of your interior than your values. The things that bother you most about other people, with that specific quality of bothering, the kind that lodges rather than passes, are likely to tell you more about what you have refused to be than any amount of careful introspection. This is the part people don't come back to, because if it's true, then There is a philosopher who thought more carefully about the refusal to think than almost anyone who preceded her. Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat responsible for coordinating the logistics of the Holocaust, arrived at a conclusion that disturbed everyone who encountered it. Eichmann was not a monster. He was, in the most precise sense, a man who had stopped thinking. Not thinking in the trivial sense of not being clever, but thinking in the sense of subjecting his own actions to genuine moral interrogation. He had learned to narrate his life in terms that made coherence available without requiring examination. He had a role, a set of procedures, a story in which he was a competent professional doing what was required. The shadow, the full weight of what he was participating in, had been successfully managed out of consciousness. Arendt called this the banality of evil. But the concept reaches further than its most famous application. What she was pointing at was the general human capacity to maintain a coherent self-narrative while systematically refusing to look at what that narrative is constructed to exclude. You are not Eichmann. But the mechanism is not unique to him. Every person who has maintained a self-story in the face of contradicting evidence, who has explained away the pattern, who has used their self-knowledge as a reason not to look further, who has become so fluent in their own interior life that genuine surprise has become nearly impossible, is using some version of this mechanism, not toward evil ends, but toward the same essential purpose, the preservation of coherence at the cost of truth. The question Arendt was really asking, the one that survives the specific context and becomes universal, is, what would it cost you to think? Not to have thoughts about yourself, to actually think, to submit your self-narrative to interrogation without already knowing where the interrogation must end. Most people cannot afford the answer. Here is where the solution most people reach for reveals its own problem. The standard response to this kind of argument, once you've accepted it intellectually, once you've nodded through the uncomfortable parts, is to add it to the project. To decide that shadow work is now a thing you do, to find a framework, a practice, a structured approach that allows you to engage with the unconscious material in an organized, manageable way. You schedule the encounter with the unknown. You approach the irrational through rational method. You turn the thing that resists the ego's management tools into one more thing the ego is managing. This is not integration. This is the shadow wearing a different outfit. Jung was explicit about this failure mode, though he rarely gets cited on it. The integration he was describing requires something more threatening than a practice. It requires the repeated experience of being wrong about yourself in ways that you did not predict and cannot immediately explain. It requires sitting with the unexplained feeling, not contextualizing it, not filing it, not making it useful, long enough that it tells you something that your existing story could not have generated. That experience cannot be scheduled. What it can be is recognized when it arrives. And it arrives reliably in the places you've been avoiding, the conversation you keep not having, the decision you've been very reasonable about not making yet, the dream that keeps returning, the person who consistently produces in you a response you can't quite account for, the thing you would do, you tell yourself, if the circumstances were slightly different, if there were more time, if you were further along, if the risk were smaller. That last one is worth sitting with longer. Viktor Frankl, writing from conditions of extreme constraint, from inside the camps, where external freedom had been reduced almost entirely, arrived at a formulation that has never been improved upon. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies the human being's capacity for choice and self-determination. The person who cannot choose how to respond has not lost freedom externally. They have surrendered it internally by filling that space so densely with narrative that the space itself has disappeared. The self-story, sufficiently developed, eliminates the gap. You already know how you respond to things because you already know who you are. The encounter with genuine open-endedness, with the moment in which you do not yet know what you will do, has become unavailable. Not because you are determined, because you have predetermined yourself. This is the cost that doesn't get named. A coherent self-narrative forecloses experience. It does not enhance it. The richest inner life is not the most organized one. It is the one most capable of genuine surprise, including surprise about itself. Consider what you have done with the parts of yourself that were unwelcome. Not the dramatic material, not the cruelty or the envy, that self-help books like to gesture at? The subtler thing. The ambition you decided was unseemly and reframed as something quieter. The anger you learned early was too much and converted into disappointment, which felt more dignified. The neediness that got transformed into independence because independence was survivable, and the neediness was not. The grief that kept showing up on schedule then got managed into something that could be integrated into the story of how you grew. Each of those transformations was, at the time, probably necessary. The question is what they cost. William James, who understood the self as plural and constructed long before it became fashionable to say so, argued that habit was the flywheel of civilization. He meant this appreciatively. Habit makes the ordinary automated so that attention can be directed elsewhere. But there is a shadow version of this observation. Habit also makes the extraordinary automated. What began as a response to a specific set of conditions becomes, over time, a default. The adaptation outlives its context. You are still managing the threat that stopped existing 15 years ago. You are still performing the competence that was necessary when you had everything to prove. You are still maintaining the distance that kept you safe in a situation that no longer exists. The self-narrative reinforces this by explaining it. This is just who I am, which is true. It has become who you are. That is precisely the problem. Nietzsche, whose reputation gets reduced almost entirely to misreadings, made an observation about the relationship between self-knowledge and self-construction that cuts against almost everything the contemporary therapeutic model assumes. The will to power, in his actual usage, is not domination of others. It is the drive toward self-overcoming, toward the willingness to revise yourself in ways that cost you something real. The opposite of this drive is what he called ressentiment, the psychological state of someone who, unable or unwilling to enact genuine self-transformation, converts the desire for change into a moral framework that makes the absence of change virtuous. You recognize this in others immediately, the person who has elevated their wound into an identity and now derives from it a kind of moral authority, the person whose values conveniently align with their limitations, the person who has made a philosophy out of not becoming. It is considerably harder to recognize in yourself. The question Nietzsche's framework actually generates, the question he was aiming at, is not whether you have ressentiment. Almost everyone does. The question is where. In what specific domain have you converted the refusal to change into a position? Where in your life does the language of values or temperament or identity serve in practice as a reason not to encounter something you have not yet been willing to encounter? This is not an invitation to self-destruction. It is an invitation to the specific discomfort of asking whether the self you've built is a foundation or a fortification. Fortifications are built to keep things out. They are appropriate responses to genuine threat, but they do not distinguish between the threat that has passed and the territory that simply hasn't been entered yet. A person living inside a fortification in peacetime is not protected. They are contained. There is a version of this that gets lived out in relationships with particular clarity, and it is worth naming because it is otherwise very easy to miss. You will find that the people who disturb you most persistently, not the people you dislike cleanly, but the people who produce something more ambiguous, something that stays with you, are almost always carrying something in your shadow. This is not a comfortable idea. It requires you to entertain the possibility that what you cannot tolerate in another person is connected to what you have refused in yourself. Not identical to it, connected. The person whose ambition embarrasses you, the person whose emotional availability you find excessive, the person whose freedom, vocational, relational, philosophical, produces in you something you immediately classify as concern or judgment, but which, looked at directly, has the texture of something closer to longing. That longing is information. Dostoevsky's Underground Man, the narrator of his most psychologically precise work, refuses every opportunity for genuine encounter because every such opportunity would require him to drop the structure through which he experiences himself as real. He tortures himself elaborately, and he tortures others. But he cannot stop because stopping would require him to exist without the narrative of his own suffering, which has become the only evidence he has that he is there at all. The suffering is not a problem to be solved. It is a proof of existence. This is extreme. But it is not foreign. Anyone who has ever found themselves attached to a particular interpretation of their own difficulty, anyone for whom being understood as someone who struggles with X has become, quietly, part of the structure of the self, is touching this. Not at Dostoevsky's intensity, but at the same root. The self-narrative that is organized around limitation, around the wound, the pattern, the thing you are still working on, does something that feels like honesty, but functions like stasis. It names the problem so precisely that the naming becomes a substitute for the change. Camus wrote that the only serious philosophical question was whether life was worth living. But what he meant by this, in the work that followed from it, was not a question about suicide. He meant, what do you do with the experience of living in a world that does not provide, from outside itself, a justification for the effort? The absurd in his framing is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be inhabited. You cannot think your way to ground. You can only choose how to stand on the groundlessness. This bears directly on the question of self-knowledge, because the desire for a stable, knowable self is, at its root, the desire for exactly the kind of external justification Camus says does not exist. The self that can be fully known is the self that has been made safe. The price of that safety is the foreclosure of genuine development, which is always at its threshold an encounter with something not yet integrated, not yet named, not yet compatible with the story you currently require. The alternative is not chaos. It is not the dissolution of the self into unstructured experience. It is something more specific and more demanding, the willingness to hold the self lightly enough that it can be revised by what you actually encounter, including what you encounter in yourself. Jung called this individuation. He was careful not to make it sound like an achievement, because he understood that it was an ongoing exposure, not a destination. The individuated person is not someone who has successfully mapped their interior. They are someone who has stopped requiring the map to be finished. There is something at stake here that is worth naming directly before this is over. You will have, at various points in this, felt the familiar movement of the self-narrative absorbing the challenge. The concept becomes something you understand. Understanding it becomes part of the story. I'm someone who has grappled with this, who sees how the ego constructs itself, who takes Jung seriously. The insight gets filed, the system updates, the threat is neutralized. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is precisely what the argument predicts. The only response that is not already inside the system is the one that cannot be prepared for. It is not a practice or a method or a new framework added to the existing ones. It is the specific, unrepeatable moment when something arrives that your current story cannot explain, and you stay with it without immediately reaching for the explanation, long enough that it changes the shape of something. That moment will not feel like growth. It will feel like ground giving way. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the privacy of his meditations, in documents he never intended anyone to read, returned again and again to a single instruction: see things as they are, not as you have been told they are, not as it would be convenient for them to be, not as your previous conclusions require them to be, as they are. He understood that this was not a skill, it was a discipline that required continuous renewal, because the pull toward the comfortable interpretation was never resolved, only repeatedly resisted. You do not arrive at an accurate perception of yourself and then stay there. You maintain the willingness to look again, knowing that what you find will not always be what you expected, knowing that some of what you find will require you to become someone you cannot yet picture. The self you think you know is real. It is also incomplete, not as a deficiency to be corrected, but as the permanent condition of being a person who is not yet finished. The question is whether you are treating that incompleteness as a problem to be solved, or as the only honest place to stand.